My name is Paul van Zyl. I'm one of the co-founders of The Conduit. And I wanted to kick off tonight by saying a few words about the subject matter. I have worked in human rights for a very significant part of my life, and I was the Executive Secretary of South Africa's Truth Commission. And Michael Ignatieff, a really important public intellectual, a Canadian philosopher, once famously said that truth commissions, the truth, all they do is narrow the range of permissible lies. And in a way, I think that may be a useful way to think about tonight, because Pranvera has assembled a incredible, not a bunch of lies, a very experienced team of journalists. Is it because I'm standing? A very experienced team of journalists who have worked in the region, and I think what we're going to try and do tonight is provide you with a set of facts and perspectives that will help frame a conversation. And everything that we try and do at The Conduit is to try and frame facts in a way that allows people in the most thoughtful way possible to think about solutions. And so one of our rules is you spend 10% of your time talking about the problem and 90% of your time talking about the solution. It's harder to achieve that balance, not least because I think the solution seems so difficult and so intractable and so far away, and the conflict and the crimes associated with it trigger such intense feelings for so many people. And I acknowledge the fact that there may be people in the room who have very close proximity to people who've been very badly hurt or lost their lives as a result of this conflict. So this was not something that occurs in a dispassionate setting. So what we're going to try and do is have a thoughtful conversation in a dispassionate way about one of the conflicts that the world has ever seen, and one that seems incredibly difficult and difficult to resolve. And try and do so in a conduit way, which is, what can we do to advance this? And I think whatever side or perspective any of us are on this conflict, I think most people think that what we want is a world in which people in the region can live side by side in peace and dignity, and not to have the kind of terrible bloodshed and loss of life that we've seen over the last couple of months. How we get there is extremely difficult to do, but I think we have to start with that goal in mind, then get to the facts, and then muddle our way through in between. So with that, I hand over to this extraordinary team, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm Chris Morris. I was a foreign correspondent with the BBC for a long time and spent quite a lot of time in the Middle East. I was reflecting with the panelists when we were preparing for this event. The first time I went to Gaza was in 1994. I was the BBC State Department correspondent. It was the first ever visit by an to Gaza. Arafat and Rabin had just shaken hands on the White House lawn, and peace was supposed to break out. And 30 years later, it's a tragedy to see where we are. Paul has set the scene for the kind of conversation we want to have. Obviously, independent journalistic access to Gaza itself is all but impossible at the moment, as you know. But our panelists have all got experience, a long experience of working in the Middle East. And one of the things we want to do is look at some of the other aspects and possible consequences of the conflict across the region, as well as a focus on the area of Gaza. With that in mind, I'm going to introduce my panelists. Left is Richard Spencer. Richard's actually the China correspondent of the Times, which may... Why is he here? Well, the reason he's here is that for a very long time he worked in the Middle East. He was the Times' Middle East correspondent from 2016 And in the last few months, until the end of January, I think, spent a lot of time in Israel reporting on the current conflict, and previously you were Middle East editor of the Daily Telegraph, so bring a long range of experience of the region. Next to Richard, freelance journalist based in London, and previously the London-based global affairs correspondent for the Washington Post. You spent 20 years in the Middle East, I think 11 of them as bureau chief of the Post, first in Baghdad and then in Beirut. And that experience in Beirut, I suppose, gives you a lot of the other incipient conflict on Israel's northern border with Hezbollah, and of course, working for that long for an American publication, the role of the US in the Middle East conflict. And then on the far side, Ramita Navai is an award-winning investigative documentary. She's reported from over 40 countries around the world, many of them in the wider Middle East. Last year, she won, well, too many awards to mention, actually, and I'll be modest on her behalf, but among them was the Royal Television Society Presenter of the Year Award. And her latest documentary, Israel's Second Front, it appeared earlier this year, and she was reporting from the occupied West Bank for PBS Frontline in the United States. So what we're going to do, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to speak for a few minutes to begin with. We will then have a conversation up here on stage, and then we will be taking questions, and in this we'll be asking for questions, not statements. Have a good conversation. And Richard, I'm going to start with you. As I say, you covered the Middle East for a very long time. You were intimately involved in covering the events of October the 7th and afterwards. You've now moved on to China, but that almost gives you a little bit of breathing space to reflect and look back. Where are we?
Thank you. Very good to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Conduit, and nice to meet you all. A few years ago, I was with a bunch of journalists, and we were Palestine, and they were a mixture of people with an interest in the Middle East, like me, and a couple of journalists who were foreign correspondents, but not specialising in the Middle East, including an older colleague who's a friend of mine, and they were quizzing me and the other sort of journalist who was Israeli about the whole issue, and it was getting quite intense, very friendly, but intense and nitty gritty, and I kind of said at one stage, well, I can't really answer that question. Come up with a solution to the Middle East crisis, the crisis. And someone said, laughingly, said, well, don't you have one? I said, well, of course I don't. And my older colleague said, why not? And I said, what do you mean, why not? Why should I have a solution to this, this enormous problem? And he said, well, have on an issue unless you have your own solution to this terrible crisis. Surely you have to have a view of what the end goal should be. And I mean, that really set me thinking, and it set me thinking in so many different ways, because I just never considered this as basically to actually solve this problem. And I have views on whether the Syrian government should stop torturing its population and things like that, but actually to come up with an end goal for this crisis hadn't occurred to me. But I thought, well, maybe he's right. Maybe that is my job. Maybe you can't report on this unless you clarify in your mind at least the principles underlying what is going on there and what is standing in the way of a solution. I mean, in some ways, kind of people outside them, all have a view of what the solution is. The solution is democracy in the Middle East, a Palestinian state, and everyone to lay down their weapons. I mean, that's kind of what most people outside the crisis want to see. The question is how to get there. And that's really come to, I'm not going to talk about what's happened in the last few months. We all have seen the broad outlines. We can talk about any particular questions that arise, but we all know the broad outlines of what happened. But the thing that strikes me as important in the debate is the lack of deference to participants, and by participants I mean public opinion as well, because public opinion is incredibly important. Much of what's happening is being done to attract support from outside powers, whether it's America, whether it's Iran, whether it's public opinion in many different countries, whether it's global south popular opinion, whatever it is. A lot of what's happening is geared towards us, and we need to think about, when we talk about what's going on in Israel and Palestine, what are we actually talking about? And as I was saying to Liz earlier, there's a paradox which I'd like to focus on at the start of this issue. Talking, are you pro-Israeli or are you pro-Palestinian? What does that, and the question is, what does that mean? And we had a ceasefire resolution passed finally by the UN Security Council yesterday. A lot of people welcome that. A lot of people have been saying that. A lot of people say there should be a permanent end to the fighting right now. End the fighting, just stop. Makes a lot of sense. Nobody wants to see these horrors perpetuated. But what, of course, that leaves us with is a situation in which Netanyahu is in control of Israel, Hamas is doing what's kind of, again, everyone outside this conflict kind of agrees on, is that Netanyahu cannot be allowed to carry on running Israel, and Hamas cannot be allowed to go on running Gaza. So where does that leave us if the desired outcome for all of us is to leave the same people in charge? And what does it also mean to say, when we're pro-Palestinian, we veer to one side or the other, when actually both sides are represented in the public sphere and in what's happening on the ground and in the public discourse by people who nobody wants to see in power? So how are we to negotiate our own particular position, whether we go on demos or write to our MPs or just talk about it amongst ourselves and on Facebook and Twitter and what have you? How can we actually address any of this issue without clarifying these points? And that means actually for all of us thinking about what the solution is. You know, what is this? If you want to remove Hamas from Gaza, if you want to remove Netanyahu and his ilk from control in Israel in the hope of replacing them with people who are more amenable to compromise, how do we get there? And how does our own discourse, people such as the Israeli electorate, other Palestine, other Arab leaders, to achieve that result? So that's a kind of conceptual framework, if you like, that I'm working from.
Thank you, Richard. I mean, Liz, obviously, if there is an outside power with any influence, it has historically been the United States. I mentioned going, went many times with the Secretary of State to Israel and countries around the Middle East. What's your reflection, having reported for a long time on what the Americans are doing now? And then also, I think you wanted to say a few words about the wider conflict, which is what's going on at Israel's northern border with Lebanon.
Well, yes, and actually they're both totally connected, so there's no two parts to this question at all. Richard just got me in a panic that I should come up with a solution, and I knew I had about 5 minutes because that's how long he was supposed to talk for. And the more years I've spent in the Middle East, the further I am from ever seeing a solution. It just gets worse and worse and worse. Every single year, every decade brings some completely new and different disaster, such as the one that we have now. And I have to say that this has gone on this since it started, and this has already far exceeded my worst expectations of what would happen. I did not imagine that the Americans would give unchecked support for so long to such a brutal and unrelenting campaign. I did think that the Israelis might bow a little bit to some of the US pressure and perhaps dial back some of what they're doing or cool it down, but instead or that they wouldn't continue to pursue this incredibly brutal campaign that we've seen in the face of no evidence that it's getting them anywhere. We haven't seen any sign yet that Hamas is any closer to being defeated or that hostage is out. And yet they continue in spite of it all. Now we have the movement from last night, which at the United Nations, which is the first real movement we've seen from the United States. And we'll have to see if that makes a difference to Israel or whether it just makes them feel even more inclined to go it alone and show that they don't need to listen to the world. But there is one aspect that has been a little bit encouraging and where the US has done quite well, which is that it has done a pretty good job of tamping down the risk of a regional conflict. I have not continued for so long, so brutally and so intensely as it has, but also I didn't think it could continue as long as it has with the brutal outcomes that we've seen without triggering some kind of regional conflict. But actually we've seen that dialed back quite a lot. And in that, the US has been very active and it's also been helped, which for its own reasons doesn't want a regional conflict. So they've worked kind of in lockstep. It's been a pretty good example of two powers who don't like each other and don't have anything to do with each other converging on this from spreading too much. And the key moment came, of course, when the the 3 US troops were killed in Jordan in January, and that was a really critical moment. The idea that the Americans would get killed was obviously going to trigger a big American response. And it did trigger a pretty sort of an escalated retaliation from America. But what we saw at that point was that the US and Iran did get together and they had secret talks and they agreed to tamp it down. So the risk of a regional conflict hasn't gone away, but the risk of a miscalculation or things spinning out of control sort of is much. So for example, we see them to attack Red Sea shipping, which is kind of their job. That's what they want to do, to be there, to play their role in this conflict. And the US is playing its role as in protecting international sea lanes by knocking down what the Houthis are doing. But it's now all happening with within a kind of parameter that this won't be allowed to escalate too far. An exception to this, and something that's still very worrying, is the situation on the Lebanon-Israel border. Israel and Hezbollah are continuing to strike at each other every single day, not as much as they were to begin with, but what we've seen is an expansion of those attacks to encompass on Israel's side a much bigger geographical area. They're now striking deep into Lebanon. They hit Baalbek just a couple of days ago, and that's really far from the border. And today they hit way up in Mount Hermel, which is about as far from Israel as you can get. And Hezbollah is showing every sign that it's going to suck it up and keep sucking it up because it's made it clear it doesn't want a war. And so it retaliates because it feels it must retaliate by hitting Israel, but it does so within a country that has been in any case evacuated by the Israelis, so there's not that much danger of them doing something that will escalate it very much on Israel's side. But it's very hard to avoid the impression that there are some on the Israeli side, and they've spoken about this, that they would like an escalation. They would like to take on Hezbollah, finish with Hamas and Hezbollah once and for all, go for broke, have a big war, and take on Lebanon as well. And that's still a possibility. And for that to happen, we have to see whether the beginnings of US pressure are going to work to contain Israel or whether they will sort of unleash even or stubborn.
Thanks, Liz. I guess, Ramita, the other aspect that you're going to discuss is the West Bank, and when the two-state solution was a flavour of the month, obviously the palace created in the West Bank and Gaza. I'm not quite sure who's echoing here. Is that you, Liz? Is it me? I don't know. We're okay. Where you reported from there, you've produced a documentary from there. There's obviously a lot of tension on the West Bank. There's obviously also tension within Palestinian politics between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Perhaps you could address both of those issues.
Yes. So the West Bank, first of all, any kind of post-Gaza, post-war negotiations, and as you said, peace talks of two-state solutions, needs to take into account and resolve some of the issues in the West Bank. And the West Bank is the most volatile and violent it's been for decades. And I was shocked by what I saw there, what we saw there actually. Kareem, I went with that guy, that baldy there. I thought, first of all, I'd run everyone through what we found in the West Bank, and then talk about, rising support for Hamas and internal politics, the weakening of the Palestinian Authority. So there's been a surge in violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. So all of this, by the way, is happening under cover of war, while all eyes rightly are on Gaza. What's happened is an escalation. Is it me? It's.
No, we can hear you better.
Right. Okay. I can hear an echo. Weird.
It's a bit echoey, but
Fine. So yeah, there's been a surge in violence against Palestinians. So over 400 Palestinians so far. Gaza, 100 children so far have been killed by Israeli settlers. Not one Israeli settler has been charged with the killing, over 9 Palestinians so far killed by Israeli settlers. Not one Israeli settler has been charged with the killing of a Palestinian. Has said that the Israeli settlers are acting with near impunity, I would say with total impunity. Over 1,000 Palestinians have fled their homes. Land grabbing, land theft is happening at an astonishing rate. By the way, so as we know, land grabs have been happening for the last 2 years. This isn't anything new. But what's happening is a phenomenon that Israeli peace activists called settler militias. Now, these are usually extremist Israeli settlers that are being that are reservists in the IDF, and they're being redeployed to their usually illegal Israeli settlements. And then they're terrorizing the local population. And what Palestinians were telling us is that they're raiding houses and villages at night, dressed in their uniforms. They're also setting up, and we came across many of these makeshift checkpoints all over the West Bank. You can see these land grabs happening. So we were there at the end of the year, and we returned at the beginning of the year, and in that time we saw loads of new illegal Israeli outposts. The reason I say illegal is because these outposts are not just illegal under international law, they're illegal even under Israeli law, and of course they're then given retrospective legal status. So mass arrests are happening in the West Bank. Over 7,350 Palestinians have been arrested so far, many of them for minor infractions like liking Facebook posts. There's been new post-war legislation, which means that detaining for 180 days without right to a lawyer. There's been a legal amendment as well, post-war legal amendment, which means you can be held for 75 days without access to a judge. I've heard terrible testimony, shocking testimony of detainees who were taken from Gaza. So there seems to be a kind of two-tiered system. What happens is that they're taken from Gaza. There's a screening process, so they're detained somewhere in often repurposed old UN schools in Gaza. They're held, and some of them are detained in detention centres in Israel, and they just disappear. But few have been released, and the testimony is shocking. So it's torture, ritual humiliation, and the humiliation, especially in Gaza, it's happened in the West Bank as well. Usually means that men, actually in hospitals, male staff are stripped naked, especially senior male staff in front of their female junior colleagues. And people are being forced to act like animals within detention centres. This is some of the testimony that I've been hearing. As well as the mass arrests, there are a raid in Jenin. At its peak, there were about 40 raids a day. These raids are pretty terrifying. So in Jenin, there was a column of armoured vehicles that rumbled into town, and the strike started. So far, 70 Palestinians have been killed by airstrikes. Most of them during these raids, and we noticed there's a pattern that happens in these raids. Bulldozers are bulldozing all the streets, looking for IEDs. But what happens every single time is that they also destroy the water and electricity mains. So after a raid, and these raids, it looks, these G camps are left looking like conflict zones. And these raids are happening because of militant groups in the West Bank. We spent time with militant groups in Jenin and in Tulkrum. And what's interesting is that these militant groups, well, as with the land grabs, have been happening for the last 2 years, but have intensified and escalated since October the 7th. And what we found, an interesting point is that these militant groups, by the way, 2 years preceding October the 7th, most of them didn't exist. So most of these militant groups were formed as a result of the raids that have been happening over the last 2 years in the West Bank. In Jenin, actually, we met a Hamas fighter. Hamas don't have much of a presence in the West Bank. He told us, and we spoke to a militant expert, that in Jenin there are about 40 to 50 Hamas fighters. What's interesting, actually, is the militant groups are running out of ammunition because they relied on money coming from Gaza, Islamic jihad, usually Islamic jihad money that was coming from Gaza that would pay for the ammunition. Of course, that money has dried up. So Hamas, so quickly, my final 2 points is talking about Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. So Hamas, so there was a really interesting poll. Very renowned academic and pollster, Khalil Shikaki, conducted a poll that was actually he finished conducting it on October the 6th, West Bank. And that poll found that Hamas, support for Hamas was an all-time low on October the 6th. That has all changed in the West Bank. So support for Hamas has surged. And it's really quite difficult to get your head around. Until you speak to Palestinians, and there was this one woman I spoke to, we were at a demonstration in Ramallah that was in support of the people of Gaza and against the bombing. And she was a secular socialist feminist. She wasn't wearing a hijab. And she was shouting support for Hamas, as was everyone. And by the way, there were low Christian groups there. And many of them were shouting kind of pro-Hamas chants. I was like, how, I just don't get it. And she said, look, obviously I am totally ideologically and politically opposed to Hamas. But everybody here will tell you the same thing, and they represents resistance. And there was another poll that Khalil Shikaki conducted that showed that pre-October 7th, most Palestinians were in favor of peaceful negotiations. That's all changed. So now in the West Bank now think that armed resistance is the only way forward. Brings me on to the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority, as you know, has no power. What's important to understand is limited power. Power is the wrong word in the West Bank. In actual fact, it only administers about a third of the West Bank. The West Bank is divided into 3 areas: Area A, B, and C. Area C is 60% of the West Bank, which is totally under Israeli security. Area A is, and that is solely administered by the Palestinian Authority, and Area B is both. So you can tell it's completely ineffective. Partly ineffective because until very recently, Israel was withholding $1 billion in tax revenues, so it couldn't even pay its own civil servants. So I mean, it's been weakened even further by the fact that it cannot protect its citizens who are being killed. It cannot help its citizens who are having their lands day by extremist settlers. And actually what we witnessed was a crackdown, a PA crackdown on Hamas support. So in front of our eyes, a young student who was at another demonstration, and there was loads of pro-Hamas chants arrested in front of our eyes, beaten up, and he was then imprisoned. And we spoke to his lawyer, who told us that there's been a surge in this crackdown, that actually the Palestinian Authority know that they're losing, have that completely lost support, and then the support for Hamas now in the West Bank. And they are also trying to curry favor with the US and with Israel, prove that they could step in to run Gaza, and are cracking down on Palestinians. And there's an interesting pattern that the I'm sorry, I'm rambling on and on and on. I'm going to wind it up in a minute. Pattern that this lawyer pointed out to us, that actually there is real collaboration, because 70% of the Palestinians that the Palestinian Authority arrests are then arrested on the same charges by the Israelis. And so then many see them as nothing. I'll wrap it up there.
Richard, how much attention at the moment is being focused in Israel on the West Bank, or is it all about Gaza and all about getting the hostages out?
Politically, the focus in Israel is entirely on internal. It's been said that the Palestinians are never mentioned in Israeli media, but that's slight exaggeration. But you don't see in the Israeli press, you don't see a lot of attention on the West Bank and what's going on there. You do in the left-wing papers, you do in Haaretz and some of the left-wing papers, but they do represent something of a minority interest in faction in Israeli politics. I mean, it's kind of, Israeli public opinion is, I find, always very hard to digest and understand. There's the radicalization of opinion on both sides has been very extreme since October the 7th, and there's a mirror in the trends that Ramita's described in Israel itself, by people who before were very critical of Netanyahu are now they're still critical of Netanyahu, but not from a position that you might think of as liberal. They're critical of him for allowing October the 7th to happen, but they're certainly not critical of the West. There is commentary on the far right and their particularly pernicious role, as we see it, in the West Bank, but it's not broadened through. It hasn't broken through to the mainstream discussion.
And Liz, I was interested in about Hezbollah actually reining themselves in. Are they doing that because Iran has told them to, or are they doing that for their own strategic interest? And I guess the other point I wanted you to address was, the other great schism in the Middle East is between Iran and Saudi Arabia. What is the current influence of Saudi Arabia and, of course, the Gulf states, including Qatar, which is home to a significant proportion of the Hamas leadership?
Well, on the first question, a lot of discussion is often given to the question of, is Iran telling Hezbollah what to do, as just Hezbollah act on its own interests with Hezbollah, and this is what they say. And I believe them. I think it's true. They say there is a complete convergence of interest between Iran and Hezbollah. They are of the same religion, they are of the same strand and the same trend and the same political ideology within that religion, and they are both same goals. So what Iran wants and what Hezbollah wants are the same. And the Hezbollah spokesman has said to me, we don't have to ask Iran what to say, because we know what Iran wants, and they know that they can trust us to know what they want, and that they trust us to do the best thing for us. So I think it's in both Hezbollah and Iran's strategic. Hezbollah wrapped into a big war with Israel, quite simply because Hezbollah is very well armed. It's much better armed than Hamas. It's a much bigger threat to Israel than Hamas is. And a war between Israel and Lebanon will be much, much bigger than the war we've seen in Gaza. And the reason why Hezbollah is so well armed, provided all the arms and the training and the money and the funding for years and years and years, which Iran and Hezbollah both admit, is that Hezbollah is like the tip of the spear of Iran's defenses, if you like. Hezbollah is Iran's deterrence against an attack on Iran by Israel, because Hezbollah can unleash a lot of murderous firepower on Israel. if Israel ever tries to. So you've got a sort of balance of mutually assured destruction going on there that makes it definitely not in Iran's interest to expend the Hezbollah deterrence against an attack on Iran for the sake of preserving Hamas in Gaza. And they also believe, and it's really hard to tell if they're right or not, because one of the things we don't know about this war is how it's actually going on the ground for Israel, because they let so few journalists observe what they're doing. Nobody really has any idea how this war is going from Israel's perspective. But Iran and Hezbollah believe that Hamas is going to kind of hold its own. And yes, it's losing people and but that they think it's going to survive. So they've got, it's in both Iran and Hezbollah's interest not to expend Hezbollah or get dragged into a big war with Israel. So Hezbollah is sort of sucking it up, if you like, because they are losing a lot of people and they are losing some key facilities, especially they're losing key clearly, giving back what they would like to give back in retaliation for that. They're letting it roll through. Now, the Iran-Saudi question is very interesting because what we saw right before October the 7th was a huge détente, and it had been going on for about 8 in the case of the UAE, and then this year with the Saudis, they all mended fences with Iran. And what the Gulf countries have done is make it pretty clear that it all kind of stems back to Donald Trump and when he didn't retaliate for the Abqaiq attack in which the drones, which might have been fired by Iran, is in Iraq, or might have been fired by Houthis. Nobody's quite definitively answered that one yet. America didn't retaliate. So the Gulf countries all decided that they couldn't rely on Trump, they couldn't rely on the United States to come to their defense if there's a big war with Iran, which they kind of hoped America would do when they don't like Iran very much. They've all mended fences with Iran, re-established diplomatic relations, and kind of sent a very clear signal to America as well that if there is a big war with, and to Israel, that if there is a big war between Israel and Iran, or between the United States and Iran, that countries to join in, the Gulf countries will sit that out. In some ways, that's sort of also being one of the reasons for an abating of the risk of regional war, because you've got the Gulf countries saying, we'll sit this out. And that makes it harder for the US to do it as well, because they wouldn't be able to use all their considerable military facilities in the Gulf if Iran. And we saw that with the attacks on the US troops in Iraq. The US retaliated, but they were not, they didn't launch any of that retaliation from any of the bases in the Middle East.
And Ramita, to what extent are those complexities of wider Middle East politics a calculation in internal Palestinian politics?
Before I answer that question, actually, I've got a question for Liz and for Richard, and it's this Hezbollah issue. So I spoke to 3 quite influential Israeli former intelligence lieutenant colonel, I think she was, and all 3 said bomb Iran, and they're seen as quite moderate. And they said that within their circles, bomb Hezbollah, sorry. Actually, they did say bomb Iran. They did say bomb Iran. They said it to me quite gleefully. I'm Iranian. So yeah, all 3 said bomb Iran, but 2 of them who have got really good inside information said that they think what will happen is that the IDF has finished with Gaza. They're going to use this as an opportunity. And actually 2 of them said it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. They're going to use this as an opportunity to push Hezbollah, certainly, back north of the Litani River. I would love to know, Hezbollah must be expecting this.
Yes, this is exactly the fear, and one of the questions has been, will they wait till Gaza's over? Because there was actually, we know now that in the first few days after October the 7th, there was a push by the Israelis to maybe take on Hezbollah first and make sure and eliminate that threat before they took on Gaza. And the Americans did manage to put pressure on them not to do that. And I think so everybody's just wondering, like, when is the Israeli strike coming and when is the Israeli push coming? And, you say these people were moderates. I mean, the public comments we've seen on this have mostly been from quite right-wing people in the government are saying the same thing. We've got to eliminate, and from Israel's perspective, it makes sense because Hezbollah is a much bigger threat to them than Hamas was. Hamas did the big attack that triggered all of this. But, you know, there's no reason to believe that maybe Hezbollah might not do something similar in the next few years. And this is again where it comes back to crucial, because they do not want a big war. They have interests in Lebanon, they kind of have good relations with Lebanese. The Americans are going to have to put pressure on Israel not to do that, and it remains to be seen. They have succeeded so far in keeping that at bay, but can they continue to do that?
On how Israel views what's going on its northern border. I mean, the last big war in southern Lebanon was in 2006. It's a long time ago now, and ever since there's been, in some ways on both sides, a feeling of there is unfinished business, because it's not a stable situation in a longer term. What is there? How much discussion is there, do you think, of that wider conflict, or is everything focused on Gaza?
Well, specifically on Lebanon, I mean, I have an insight of this, having written about it just before Christmas. I was both, well, I like to think my story was fascinating, but the actual aftermath of the story I wrote was particularly interesting. I wanted to write about this because, as with the Ramita, people were telling me from different points in the political spectrum and military spectrum in Israel, yeah, we you know, very definite about it. And there was a build-up on the northern border, and there was a lot of pressure from the people who live near the northern border to do so, because they've I can't remember the figures now. It was 100,000 people have been withdrawn, civilians have been withdrawn from the northern border area, and they're saying we're not going to go in the same place on the other side of the Lebanon border as Hamas were on October the 6th on the Gaza border. Even if there's an outbreak of peace, you have to get rid of Hezbollah before we go back to the border. And of course, that has I mean, there's a history there, but it's economically important. It's symbolically important for Israel's sense of its identity, that those 100,000 people should go back to the border. So I thought it was a very interesting issue, and I spoke to people, as Ramita did, who was saying yes, and I spoke to military people, and a very senior officer said, you know, we've drawn up plans, we've put our plans into the war cabinet. We're ready to go when they say yes. It's a very senior, active general. And so I went to obviously I had to go to the army to get a formal response. Well, come up to the border. We've actually got a few journalists coming up on Monday if you want to join them. And we're doing a little embed along the border, not exactly an embed, but you can come talk to soldiers on the border. And they gave me briefings. They took me to the watchtowers and everything, and spoke to squaddies on the border who are saying, yep, we're raring to go. Spoke to a veteran reservist who's now back saying, yeah, I was in Lebanon in 2006 and we didn't want to leave, and we should finish the job then and stuff like this. So I wrote a piece about all this, and I got on the record quotes from Conricus, who you'll know as the former IDF spokesman, acting as an IDF spokesman, very much saying, we're ready to go. And then I wrote the story. I mean, it was kind of fairly, didn't even think it was controversial. And I got called all the next day after it appeared by IDF spokespeople, but for the head of Northern Command. And they specifically said, I speak on behalf of the head of Northern Command. This is a completely wrong story. We have no intention at the moment. We are, of course, subject to orders. Things might change. This is completely exaggerated. Why did you say? You can see with the quotes. I mean, there's a quote there from Gallant, the Ministry of Defence, saying, we want to go and take out Hezbollah. Just take it up with your boss. Don't take it up with me. So, but they were very angry about it. And I was kind of puzzled. But what that reflects is actually there is a divided opinion on this, as there is so much in the Israeli establishment. And actually, the word moderate, I say, maybe should be retired from this entire debate, actually, because surprisingly, the person who's holding out against it is Netanyahu. Gallant, the defense minister, which is why I questioned him, is very gung-ho to go in. Eisenkot is against. The former chief of staff has been brought sidekick to Benny Gantz in the war cabinet. Benny Gantz, as always, is slightly mysterious, but would probably go in if if pushed. So at the moment, it's Netanyahu's the casting vote saying no. So it's within Israel, and I think that at the moment America is saying no, and so long as America says no on this one, they will probably not. But it's not certain, I'd say.
I want to go to questions from the audience in a second, but just one question to all three of you, really, and it may sound a little bit we are at the moment, but what is your opinion on whether the horrible events of the last few months have actually brought a two-state solution closer? Stunned silence. Liz is going first.
It's interesting because if you look at the plan the Americans are trying to push for the ceasefire agreement, I mean, all this time that they've been pushing for a ceasefire, but while saying they want to ceasefire and pushing these talks, thousands and thousands of people are dying, and we're probably going to have very soon the mass starvation of a lot of people. I mean, it will happen at some point. It takes a long time to die of hunger, but it will reach a point where it's not just the weakest ones who are dying. It will be like everybody will reach a point where their organs don't get food anymore. So you could have everything accelerated by the mass death of people from starvation. But the plan the Americans are pushing is actually really substantial. And if it happens, it will be revolutionary and groundbreaking. I mean, they're pushing the two-state solution. They would recognize the Palestinian state in advance of the success of the negotiation. The Saudis established, the US opens an embassy in Ramallah to recognize the Palestinians. There were a lot of other steps that would really, really transform the whole situation. So if this does work, it could end up bringing the situation even closer. But when you hear about, the way public opinion in Israel isn't even talking about the Palestinians, they're not even interested. They are behind the Gaza campaign and in its full onslaught. It makes it seem even further away. So I answered that with saying yes and no.
I would say that how can the Palestinians accept a two-state solution with 1 million settlers and with the West Bank looking like a piece of Swiss cheese, where the holes in the Swiss cheese are the bits of Palestinian towns and villages. So I think, that the US have got this brilliant plan, but in reality, a mountain to climb clearly, and you can understand why the Palestinians now are so resistant to certain negotiations when it comes to a two-state solution. Also, I think at the moment talks of a unified Palestinian Authority are really interesting. So this could possibly mean some kind of coalition government with Hamas. So the Palestinian Authority, they met in February, they met, representative from the PA and Hamas met in Moscow, that Basti, and there have been secret talks between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority realised for their survival they need to go into coalition, and even independent politicians like Mustafa Barghouti are now open to this, and so I think interesting in the mix. How do you now deal with Hamas? So it's a non-answer, really.
Any thoughts before we go to the audience?
Sure. I mean, Liz's answer, yes and no, is actually completely logical, in the sense that, what won't happen is a reversion to the status quo. In some form, the status quo, but the status quo has changed immeasurably because of what happened and the attack of October 7th and the death and destruction that's been wrought afterwards, and importantly, as Ramita says, what's happened with inside Palestine and the Palestinian factions. Given that, the two-state solution was being declared dead before this. Talk to anyone for the last 2 years and say the two-state solution is dead, it won't happen. What you were seeing was this constant chipping away at the West Bank by settlers, Gaza not accepting, the status quo, not accepting the blockade, not accepting, not dealing with Israel, but not at that point we thought overtly challenging it either. It seemed as if there'd be a continuation of what was going on, which was a constantly chipping away at Israel's legit rest of the world, and a constant chipping away of the Palestinian hopes of any form of real self-determination. Now that's changed. There's got to have to be something changed, and what will happen is either an incredibly illegitimate, in the views of the Israeli state, exerting direct control over Gaza and a continuous insurgency both in Gaza and on the West Bank, or you will see something happen on the Palestinian side, or you will see America forcing a solution on Israel and external force forcing both actors here to change course. That wasn't going to happen before. It might happen now. I still think the actual outcome in the next couple of years is probably not that. It's my first really illegitimate Israel in the eyes of much of the outside world, including increasing numbers of the American population, enforcing their will on the situation, and with very unpredictable consequences of what happens in 5 years' time. I think, and the aid thing is very interesting. If there is mass starvation, then that again changes things. If Israel allows just enough drip feed of aid and food and whatever to go in to establish some sort of new status quo, I mean, it's horrific, but you can see that happening for at least the next couple of years. And then, then you see what happens in the US election. You see if Trump wins the election, what he's going to do. I mean, it's very unpredictable. In what he's going to do. I mean, that's a situation where you can see what Liz talks about from the American perspective gradually ramping up. As long as Biden is in a position to actually, control policy in a way that American presidents haven't done in the Middle East for getting on for 2 decades.
Okay, we're going to take some questions from the audience. We've got a microphone over here, one here. We'll take 2 or 3 at a time. There's one here. And as I say, if you could keep them shortish, because we've probably talked too much already. So.
Yes, sorry, my page of notes, I'll be sure not to do that. But Piotr, formerly Crisis Group in UN. There's one question I have, which is about international law, and I want to use all of the examples we've talked about regarding that. Ever since the war began, the Israelis have largely renounced on the pioneering things that they've managed, such as roof knocking. For the audience, that's where you launch a non-explosive projectile to warn the occupants that they need to escape before they blow up the building. We've seen so I'm just curious, what do you think that this situation is doing for war, be it in Israel and Gaza as belligerent occupant, between Hezbollah, non-state actors, and Iran, but also the maritime situation with the Houthis, which I think deserves mention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then one here.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question specifically around press, obviously Washington Post, The Times. We've seen a lot of quite biased media in the West. A lot of media fails to describe the occupation that's been going on for 76 years. They act as if this all started. There are really grave truths that have been missed out of Western narratives in the press, and that's why I love, the work that you've done and what you've described. So what will it take for Western media to actually finally tell the public the truth? And we were to do that, we could see actual justice come about. So I'd love to know your opinion on that.
Okay, let's take those 2, because that's quite a lot there. You're not telling the truth, and the laws of war, I suppose, in various forms.
I can answer about the laws of war, because I've written a fair bit about this, both before October the 7th and since. It's the roof tapping is part of a wider issue, which is, the famous euphemism of collateral damage, and I think the question of what it means for our understanding of war, again, gruesome to say, but I think that understanding of the issues involved have perhaps taken a step forward, because it's so extreme what Israel has done. Also being kind of open about it. I mean, it's quite interesting how willing they are to discuss this issue, and you know, they speak a bit around the topic, but when, you know, not only a little bit around the topic. So they of course, their official line is, you know, we are the most moral arm involved in all our targeting processes. We take very seriously the issue of collateral damage. You know, every decision to bomb a target is assessed for the likelihood of civilian harm and whether the military target justifies it. Is in line with Western thinking. You know, you will get the same principle argument from British military and American military in terms of the bombing campaigns in Syria and Iraq and so on over 20, 30 years. What they have said is they have been open that calculation changed because they regarded what happened on October the 7th as such a grave threat to Israel and to its identity that they could change the parameters. So they still say they do this, but they don't put a figure on it. No military says, you know, for one Hamas commander will kill 10 civilians if we have to. In the same way, you won't get that calculation from Americans when it comes to killing an ISIS leader and civilians. But those are the calculations that are made. And I actually wrote a piece about 2 or 3 years ago, where a great group, Air Wars, which some of you may be aware of in this country, and similar groups ranging from sort of laws of war academics to statisticians have looked at these issues, and they've done studies on, you know, for example, they ask officers in the, you know, they give them scenarios, and they give the same scenario to officers in different air forces and say, you know, would you say yes or no? You know, how many people would you have to kill to get this particular target? And actually, Israel came out better than the Americans on those categories. But what it also showed that is those calculations change depending on the war that Israel is fighting. And now, you know, this is a wishy-washy answer. I don't know where it goes, but I think the fact that those things are being discussed is something hopefully we will take forward and say, you know, it's not enough to say, you know, there has to be collateral damage or that we accept collateral damage. You know, it's you know, there is no military in the world that's going to say we will never kill a civilian in pursuit of a military target. But the discussion about, you know, where we draw the line, because you know, I'm not going to hold an opinion poll. I suspect quite a lot of people think the line has been crossed in Gaza, even if it hadn't been before, even if it hadn't been in Raqqa or Mosul, which is the 2 places that I have seen that were completely destroyed by the West, with much less complaint than in Gaza, which therefore Israel uses for comparison. But I think we now have to start looking at those issues quite seriously. I mean, in your terms of press, I mean, you know, give me an example. I mean, I don't think I've suppressed a narrative. I don't think Liz has suppressed a narrative. There's a big difference between the reporting on this war and some of the opinion columns, which are much more hysterical. But I think my newspaper and your newspaper have reported on both sides of this issue in some depth. That's all I can say.
To put in a few words of support for Western media here, of course, Western media always gets things wrong and always does things badly, and everybody's always writing on deadline and always writing at the last minute. But most of the things we talked about here and the things are things we know about, and we know about them from the Western media. The vast majority, I mean, all 100% of the coverage from Gaza, which has been extensive, has come from Gaza people. The people of Gaza. The BBC has correspondents there, Al Jazeera English has correspondents there, CNN has correspondents there. They're doing the most unbelievable job to the world, the horrors that they are living through, often at huge expense to themselves and their family. And we've all seen what happened to that family. And I would draw your attention. I think one newspaper I think that has done an extremely good job of bringing light to the situation in Gaza is the Washington Post, and I would encourage you to take out a subscription, because you do have to take out a subscription. But my colleagues there have done an incredible job of exposing things. And for example, one of them, a recent investigation that we did, which was in depth, looked at the son of Walid Datu, who was injured, and he lost his wife and his children, and then his son was also an Al Jazeera journalist, and they were killed by a drone sent by Israel, which said that which accused them of flying a drone and therefore threatening Israelis. A deep investigation using the evidence of the drone footage that the dead journalist had taken, to show that there were absolutely no Israeli troops within miles of this incident, therefore that they could not have possibly posed a threat. So there's been a lot of investigation. You get things like, some of the newspapers give very passive headlines like 10 people died in airstrike as Israel makes plans for the future, and you don't know who did the airstrike and things like that. And sometimes that might reflect bias. Sometimes that's just newspaperese taking over. But you also have a lot of very excellent Arab reporters, Arab American reporters, Arab British reporters, people who are from the area, people who speak the language, reporting and working in the region now, and they're going into depth on this. So in a newspaper on any given day, a reported story about the level of hunger in Gaza, and you'll see a story about the Israeli government saying this, this, and this. And those two stories might give opposite perspectives, but I think you are going to find out from Western media how bad things are in Gaza.
Ramita, do you want to?
Yeah,
I
do want to add to that, because while I absolutely agree with Liz, and I mean, my esteemed colleagues here have been doing amazing work, I would say that I have encountered pressure, not me personally, but there has been pressure covering this story that I had not seen on any other story. So there was an expose. Chris McGreal in The Guardian wrote an expose about the pressure that CNN journalists were under, covering that story, covering this story and what was happening there. And I have come across many examples. A friend of mine recently pitched a story to a major media organization. And the story was about children in Gaza who were left severely injured amputees. It was a brilliant pitch, actually. I saw the whole pitch. This friend of mine was told by this major media organization, yes, but you need to cover Israeli children as well. The Israeli hands, 3 hands maybe, there are 3,000 at least Gazan children who have been left severely disabled or are amputees. 25,000 Gazan children have been injured. And this kind of both sidisms is false equivalence that does exist. So yes, I think there are issues, but at the same time, I think people have done amazing work, and all these investigations are from Western media, mainstream media that you can trust, quite frankly. I would say for the first time in my career, I have come across this kind of weird obsession with kind of both sides of the story that leads to absolute false equivalence.
So impartiality should not mean fake balance, basically, is should we just take some lady?
Is this on? Yeah. Thank you. That was a really full, comprehensive answer to those questions. I really enjoyed that. I slightly revised my opinion because I've experienced mainstream media is extremely biased. So my question is really about UK politics, because as you know, there's been a huge politicization of a young generation. There are 500,000 people on marches every time. Lots of young women, lots of families across the spectrum. They're really diverse marches. In many ways, they are the only place where you get to hear the Palestinian voice, apart from on social media. And so people are getting their news from Instagram, from online accounts, from sharing. That's where there's huge action going on. I think a tiny minority of people are getting their information from the Times, I'm sorry, or even the BBC or something like that. If you're interested, you're on social media, seeing all kinds of horrific images and posts. And then there are celebrities, as you know, like Motaz Aziza, or left Gaza now, but they became kind of people, millions took them to their hearts. As you know, Motaz has 18.5 million followers. There's a campaign going on called No Ceasefire, No Vote. There's going to, and then there's been a sort of pushback with the accusation that somehow these marches equate to extremism, and I'm going to go in the next election because it is a mass political movement taking place.
So, gentleman here.
It seems to me.
He's got a loud voice, but he needs a microphone.
You hear me now? It seems to me, and I'm not certainly as well informed as you all are, but it seems to me that the major going on have not been very effective. And if you think outside of the box, you could ask yourself, why doesn't Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or some of the other countries in the area take a more active role, or why can't they be urged to take an active role, or why can't we kind of get them involved in a solution? I mean, for instance, this might be very naive and very stupid, but saying to Hamas, all right, you have to have an unconditional surrender and release all the hostages, and then we'll begin to work on solutions. But anyway, who's ever involved now, whether it be the US, the UN, or the major powers, they're not doing anything. I'm not doing it. They're doing something, but they're not very effective. Why don't we get some players who have not been as active, involved, and try to work something out? Sorry.
Okay. Impact on UK election. I guess part of that is impact on the Labour Party and whether it support one. You could say the same about the US, actually. In a close US election, could Joe Biden lose Michigan because of the lack of support from Arab Americans, which could swing a very close election towards Donald Trump? So I guess I've broadened it out slightly, but because, to be fair, the panelists aren't experts on UK politics, but overall the impact of what's going on in Gaza on the political systems in Western countries and on elections in Western countries in a big election year.
Well, I would just say that you've touched on something which I think is bigger than the question of the impact of this on the next British election, which is the intergenerational gap that's emerged, and Joe Biden exemplifies that perfectly. Joe Biden represents a generation of Western leaders. I mean, Joe Biden was just about alive when the Holocaust was taking place. My generation grew up in the shadow of our parents having been alive when the Holocaust was taking place. It was very much a kind of very vivid thing, and preventing the Holocaust was like the number one goal in life. You've got several generations removed. You've got new atrocities being committed and new ways of looking at things. When Biden went to meet Netanyahu, he really showed his age, because he said, in the room, he stood next to Netanyahu and he said, I remember being in this room in 1974 with Golda Meir, and I promised then that I would never. In 1974, it was a different Israel, a different Arab world. Israel was facing down supposedly a threat from the Arab armies, which turned out to be a paper tiger threat. It's not under any threat from Arab armies anymore. It's under threat from, goodness, so many forces. And you could say it's under threat from it's taking self-destructive policies so many times. So, and a young generation is emerging that's looking at this completely differently. I think Israel has to ask perhaps the biggest question of all of what this intergenerational shift in attitude is going to do to the survival and prospects for Israel in the long term.
Any other comments on Western elections? If not, maybe we could almost close on this gentleman's comment. And Paul began by talking about solutions. I think your point is very valid. Anyone involved at the moment isn't doing a good job. Where do we go for a search for a solution? Are there any other actors that could intervene and play any kind of role?
I don't think there are, actually. I mean, the Saudis are not that powerful. The Americans are desperately still trying to get them to mend fences with Israel and make a relationship as part of this big package of a solution. But I think what's very interesting is that you can see that despite all the big fuss about the UAE mending, establishing diplomatic relations with Israel, one place that nobody talks to at the moment is the UAE. Who are they talking to? They're talking to the Saudis and to the Qataris, who don't have the diplomatic relations with Israel. That's where the kind of influence and balance. The Qataris have maintained relations with Hamas throughout this period at the request of the Americans, the Americans like Qatar. They trust Qatar. Qatar hosts a big base for them. Qatar pays for that base. Qatar is like a kind of linchpin of the world, if you like it. It's a linchpin for so many things. Qatar is playing a huge role in the negotiations between Israel, Hamas, and the United States over the ceasefire for hostages deal, which is a part of this bigger package, which the Americans are also negotiating with the Saudis. But really, the Gulf countries don't have that much influence to talk to any of these people, except for the Americans on Israel, and otherwise there's not much that can be done. And the Americans have their own set of reasons for dealing with Israel in the way they do, which all go to all these other issues we've talked about, including Biden is deeply invested in Israel.
Richard? I think I'd go further than Liz. Liz talked earlier about Liz talked earlier about the detente between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the Gulf states. I think what that was a catastrophic defeat for Saudi Arabia and Iran and the UAE. It was not a ceasefire on equal terms. Iran not diplomatically in Yemen and more broadly by exposing the shallowness of the Americans to the Gulf, not Saudi Arabia and UAE out of the game. What we have in this war is an asymmetric war. It's a classic asymmetric war. As Liz says, Hamas can claim in some ways to have already won the war, and they do claim to have won the war. Yeah, of course, if we look at it from any normal warfare point of view, look at Gaza and say they won. I mean, that's completely absurd. So we're in a different paradigm of warfare, which is asymmetric. All those states want to, saying, we don't want to be on the wrong end of that asymmetric war. We'll stay out of it. Thank you very much. If Israel is going to be the victim of the asymmetric, victim I use, is going to be on that side of the asymmetric war, then we'll leave them to it. Thanks. An American can, which is the expert in asymmetric wars, because it's been fighting and losing them for decades. We'll leave them in charge. China's this.
I was going to say your new job, the only other major power in the world
talking about it, and they're looking at it and they're saying, absolutely no, we're not going to get involved.
Ramita, final thoughts?
Do you know what? I'm happy to leave it with these guys.
Okay. Well, in that case, we are over time. So thank you all very much for coming. Richard, Liz, and Ramita. Thank you.
You said you was the president.